Silence, no wind, no birds, only the sound of snow falling over a landscape that seems frozen in time. Yellowstone, Wyoming, United States of America. We are at the heart of the oldest national park in the world, a place the Native Americans called the land that smokes, a place where the earth itself breathes through its wounds, where hot springs punch through the crust and geysers throw boiling water into a sky so blue it almost hurts to look at. But something is missing here, something that should be present, and its absence has changed everything you see before your eyes. For 70 years, this place lived in a strange silence, a silence that was not peace. It was a deep, quiet, almost invisible imbalance, like an orchestra missing the instrument that holds the rhythm. Everything still sounds like music, but something is wrong. Something fundamental is off, and you cannot name it until that missing note finally returns. The missing instrument had 4 legs, teeth, and a howl that can be heard 10 kilometers away. The wolf. And when it finally returned, in January of 1995, nobody was prepared for what was about to happen. Because the wolves did not simply change who ate whom. They changed the rivers. They changed the trees. They changed the way the wind moves through the valleys. They changed time, space, and the very nature of fear itself. This is the story of how a handful of wolves transformed an entire ecosystem, and of what that story teaches us about the world, about nature, and about ourselves. To understand what the wolves did when they came back, you first have to understand what happened when they left. We travel back in time. We are in the 19th century. The American West is still a wild, vast, and unpredictable world. Gray wolves, Canis lupus, are the most widely distributed land carnivore on the planet. From Alaska to Mexico, from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains, wolves are part of the landscape the way rivers and clouds are part of it. They are not visitors. They are not strangers. They are structural. They are as much a part of this land as the rock beneath it. In Yellowstone, wolf packs follow the great herds of bison and elk across the high plateaus and through the deep river valleys. They are the heartbeat of the ecosystem, the invisible engine that keeps everything in motion, the force that determines where animals go, how long they stay, and how the land itself takes shape over time. And then the settlers arrive, and with them, fear. The wolf has always occupied a peculiar place in the human psyche. It is the monster of fairy tales, the enemy of livestock, the creature that prowls the darkness just beyond the firelight. Centuries of European folklore had built an image of the wolf as the embodiment of evil, of threat, of the uncontrollable wild that must be defeated and driven back. The ranchers of the American West needed no convincing. To them, the wolf was an economic problem with fangs. Every dead calf was money lost. Every attacked sheep herd was a ruined season. There was no nuance available when you were trying to survive on the margin of a hard land. The federal government responded to this pressure in the only way it knew how at the time, with a systematic extermination campaign. A predator control program was established across the entire West. Poison baits were laid out across thousands of kilometers of wilderness. Steel traps were set in the paths of wolf travel. Bounties were offered for every dead wolf, creating a small economy of killing that drew hunters and trappers into the most remote corners of the land. And it worked. By 1926, the last documented wolf in Yellowstone was shot. There was no ceremony. There was no official mourning. There were no newspaper editorials lamenting the loss, just a single shot in the silence of the mountains, and then nothing. The wolf had disappeared from Yellowstone, and with it, without anyone yet knowing it, something far deeper had disappeared as well. The first years after the local extinction of the wolf seemed normal enough. The park was still beautiful. Tourists came in growing numbers. Rivers ran, bison grazed on the great open meadows, elk were everywhere, abundant and visible, which the tourists loved. But beneath that apparently calm surface, the ecosystem was beginning to unravel, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but inevitably. To understand why, you have to understand one fundamental thing about nature. Fear is not just an emotion. Fear is an ecological mechanism. Fear is what keeps prey animals moving. What prevents them from staying too long in one place? What forces them to use the landscape in a dispersed and shifting way rather than concentrating permanently in the most productive and convenient spots? When the wolf pack is hunting a valley, the elk in that valley do not simply run away. They change. Their stress hormones rise. Their feeding time decreases. They become more alert, more mobile, more willing to trade the best food for the relative safety of open ground where predators cannot approach unseen. They stop lingering in the dense, rich vegetation along the riverbanks. They move constantly, driven by an anxiety that is written into their nervous systems after millions of years of coevolution with predators. When the wolf disappeared, something extraordinary happened to the elk of Yellowstone. They relaxed, and that relaxation had consequences that no biologist of the time could have fully predicted, because the science needed to understand those consequences had not yet been developed. Elk are large and efficient herbivores. An adult elk can consume between 9 and 12 kilograms of vegetation per day. And when they have no predators to keep them moving, they tend to settle in the most convenient places. The riverbanks, the open valleys, the clearings where the grass is most tender and most abundant, the places where food is easy and danger is absent. That is exactly what happened. Without wolves, elk began spending more and more time on the banks of rivers and streams. They ate the young willows before they could grow. They ate the aspens, the ashes, the cottonwoods, stripping bark in winter and browsing the new growth in spring. They grazed the same spots over and over, returning day after day, season after season, until the vegetation simply could not recover fast enough to replace what was being taken. Scientists had a name for this phenomena, riparian overgrazing, but the technical words did not capture the reality of what was happening. What was happening was a slow, silent degradation of the entire river system, spreading year after year from every riverbank in the park. The riparian plants disappeared. Without deep roots to hold the soil in place, the riverbanks began to erode. The water, without the resistance of vegetation, ran faster and more directly, cutting through the soil instead of filtering through it. Rivers became channels. Channels became erosion scars. The rivers of Yellowstone grew wider and shallower, losing their complexity, losing their structure, losing the intricate habitat they had provided for millennia. And as the rivers changed, so did the animals that depended on them. Beavers, which relied on willows and aspens to build their dams, began to disappear. Without beavers, there were no dams. Without dams, there were no wetlands. Without wetlands, the frogs vanished, the ducks diminished, the otters left, and the fish that had bred in the calm, shallow waters behind beaver dams lost the nurseries their species had used for thousands of years. The landscape of Yellowstone was changing, not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a person's face changes as they age, so gradually that those who are nearby every day barely notice until one day they look at an old photograph and cannot recognize what they are seeing. The change was real, and it was accelerating. There is something deeply ironic in the story of Yellowstone that deserves a moment of genuine reflection, because it contains a lesson that goes far beyond this one park in the mountains of Wyoming. This park was created in 1872, the first national park in the world, with a vision that was noble and revolutionary for its time: to protect nature from human exploitation. The United States Congress decreed that this place should be preserved in its natural condition for the benefit and enjoyment of the people for all generations. But in its first century of existence, the managers of the park applied to nature the same logic used on a cattle ranch: eliminate the predators, protect the large herbivores that visitors paid to see, make the ecosystem more pleasant, more predictable, more manageable. They eliminated not only the wolves, they also pursued and reduced mountain lion populations. They controlled coyotes. They suppressed wildfires with aggressive firefighting policies that prevented the natural renewal of forests. They managed the park the way you would manage a garden, pulling out what seemed dangerous or disruptive and protecting what seemed beautiful and harmless. They were, with the best of intentions and with no malice whatsoever, destroying exactly what they had promised to preserve. This is not a story about bad people. It is a story about incomplete understanding, about the immense difficulty of seeing a system that is larger and more interconnected than any human mind can fully hold. We tend to think of ecosystems as paintings, as static and beautiful scenes that we must shield from disturbance. But ecosystems are not paintings. They are dances. They are conversations. They are dynamic processes where change, even violent change, fire, predation, flood, death, is not the enemy of the system, but the engine of it. A park without predators is not a protected ecosystem. It is a system with a critical component removed, running without the regulating force that shaped every other part of it over millions of years. And Yellowstone, the place that had been protected more carefully and more consistently than virtually any other wild place in North America, was slowly revealing itself to be a case study in what happens when human beings, however well-intentioned, try to manage a natural system they do not fully understand. The scientists who studied the park during the 1970s and 1980s could see the symptoms. They measured the degraded rivers. They documented the absence of young willows and aspens in areas that should have had them. They counted elk populations that were growing beyond what the land could sustainably support. They noted the near disappearance of beavers from streams that had historically been rich with them. But for a long time, the full picture remained incomplete. The pieces were present. The diagnosis was not yet assembled. That assembly would begin after 1995, after the return of the wolf. The decision to reintroduce wolves to Yellowstone was not fast or simple. It was the result of decades of scientific debate, political conflict, and a cultural argument that tore communities apart across 3 states and echoed in the halls of the United States Congress. The intellectual foundation for the reintroduction had been laid, ironically, by a man who had spent years killing wolves. Aldo Leopold was one of the most important environmental thinkers of the 20th century. In his early career, he was a committed participant in the federal predator control programs of the early 1900s. He believed, as virtually everyone believed at the time, that eliminating wolves was an act of good land management, a way of protecting deer and elk populations for hunters and of safeguarding the livestock that ranchers depended on. And then something happened that changed him permanently. Leopold was in the mountains of New Mexico. He and his companions had shot a wolf at the base of a cliff, a mother with her grown pups. He climbed down to where the dying animal lay and watched as what he would later describe as a fierce green fire died in her eyes. He did not explain it clinically. He did not analyze it immediately. He simply watched the light go out and felt something shift inside him. Years later, in his masterpiece, A Sand County Almanac, Leopold wrote about that moment with an honesty that was rare and courageous for a man of his background and profession. He admitted that he had been wrong, that the elimination of wolves from the American West had not improved the land, that the mountains he loved were being eaten alive by deer and elk populations that had no natural check. That thinking like a mountain, as he famously put it, meant understanding that the predator and the prey were not enemies within the ecosystem, but partners in a balance that took millennia to develop. Leopold died in 1948, before the reintroduction he had intellectually made possible. But his ideas survived him and grew more influential with each passing decade. By the 1970s and 1980s, a new generation of ecologists was building on Leopold's foundation, developing the scientific framework that would eventually justify and guide the reintroduction of wolves, not just to Yellowstone, but to wild places around the world. These scientists were articulating something that Leopold had sensed intuitively, that large predators are not simply animals at the top of a food chain. They are regulators of entire ecosystems. They are what ecologists would come to call keystone species, organisms whose influence on the system around them is so disproportionate to their numbers that removing them changes virtually everything. A keystone in an arch is not the largest stone. It is not the most visible stone, but remove it and the arch collapses. The wolf was the keystone of Yellowstone, and for 70 years, the arch had been slowly failing. But science alone does not drive policy. Science has to fight its way through politics, economics, fear, and culture before it can change anything in the real world. The opposition to wolf reintroduction was intense and deeply felt. The ranchers of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho had built their lives and their identities around the land. They had inherited ranches from parents and grandparents who had themselves fought hard against the wilderness to create something. For them, the wolf was not an abstraction. It was a direct threat to everything they had built. Their fears were not irrational. Wolves do kill livestock. The historical record showed that clearly. And while the actual economic impact of wolf predation was, in most studies, smaller than ranchers feared, the fear itself was real and the occasional losses were real. A wolf that kills 15 sheep in a single night, which does occasionally happen, is not a theoretical problem. It is a material crisis for a family operating on a thin margin. The hunting community had its own concerns, grounded in a different set of values but equally sincere. In the mountain states, hunting is not a hobby. It is a tradition, a source of food, a connection to the land, and a significant part of the regional economy. Outfitters, guides, and the businesses that serve them depended on healthy elk and deer populations. If wolves reduced those populations, the economic and cultural consequences would be real. And then there was something harder to name but equally powerful, a sense among many rural communities that the reintroduction was being imposed on them by distant elites, by urban environmentalists and federal bureaucrats who would not have to live with the consequences of their decisions. that the people who actually lived in wolf country were being overruled by people who wanted to see wolves when they visited on vacation. This feeling was not entirely wrong, and acknowledging it is important because it shaped the politics of wolf reintroduction in ways that continue to this day. On the other side of the debate stood a coalition of scientists, conservation organizations, and a growing segment of the American public, largely urban, that had come to see the wolf as a symbol of something important. For these people, the wolf represented the idea that wild nature had intrinsic value, that wilderness was not just a resource to be managed, but a living system with the right to exist in its full complexity, that the extermination of predators across the American West had been a mistake, and that a mistake had both the opportunity and the obligation to correct it. Public hearings across Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho were extraordinary events. People stood up and wept. They shouted. They threatened. A rancher from outside Cody, Wyoming, stood at a microphone and said that reintroducing wolves would be like releasing convicted criminals into a neighborhood and expecting the residents to be grateful. An ecologist from the University of Montana described the absence of wolves from Yellowstone as an ecological wound that was bleeding the park dry. Both were speaking from genuine convictions. Neither was entirely wrong. The wolf had become a mirror in which Americans saw themselves. The debate was not really about wolves at all. It was about what kind of relationship Americans wanted to have with the natural world, about whether wildness was compatible with civilization, about who had the right to decide what nature should look like. After years of environmental impact studies, hundreds of public meetings, and multiple rounds of legal challenge, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service finalized the reintroduction plan. The wolves would come from Canada. They would be designated as a non-essential experimental population, a legal classification that would give wildlife managers more flexibility in responding to livestock depredation. Compensation programs would be established to reimburse ranchers for documented wolf kills. None of this satisfied everyone. Nothing could have. But after decades of argument, after the death of Aldo Leopold and the research of a generation of ecologists who had built on his foundation, after lawsuits and counter-lawsuits and congressional battles and public campaigns, the moment had finally arrived. January 12th, 1995. It is cold in the way that only the Northern Rockies in January can be cold. The air is dry and sharp, and the cold gets into you through every gap in your clothing. The snow on the ground is hard-packed, compressed by weeks of overnight temperatures well below freezing. The sky is the pale gray-white of a world that has not seen direct sun in days. At the Roosevelt border crossing between Montana and Alberta, a convoy of government vehicles pauses at the border station. The Canadian wildlife officers have done their work. The American wildlife officers take over. Inside the convoy, in wooden transport crates lined with straw, are 14 gray wolves captured over the preceding weeks in the foothills and valleys near Jasper, Alberta. These wolves are among the most thoroughly studied animals on the planet at this moment. Each one has been captured, weighed, measured, blood sampled, vaccinated, fitted with a radio collar, and assigned a number. They have been sorted into family groups to maximize the chances of successful pack formation in their new home. Everything that can be known about their genetics, their health, and their social relationships has been recorded. But they know none of this. They know only the straw beneath them, the smell of strange humans, the vibration of the vehicle, and the scent of a landscape they have never traveled, but whose elements, the conifer forest, the cold air, the distant elk, their genes recognize as home, Doug Smith was there that day. Smith, who was then a young biologist and would become the leader of the Yellowstone Wolf Project, had been working toward this moment for years. He had studied wolves in Minnesota, had followed their tracks through the forests of the upper Midwest, had learned to read the language of wolf behavior in snow and mud and bone. He knew what wolves were. He knew what they could do. And as he stood in the cold Montana morning and watched the convoy roll south toward Yellowstone, he felt something that he has described in interviews over the years as a kind of trembling combination of scientific excitement and something that felt almost like reverence. These animals were going back. The wolves were transported to large acclimation pens inside the park boundaries. 1 to 2 hectares of fenced forest where each pack group would spend several weeks adjusting to their new environment before being released. The pens allowed the wolves to hear, smell, and begin to understand the landscape around them. They could hear elk bugling in the distance. They could smell the park through the fence. And on March 21st, 1995, for the first time in nearly 7 decades, a wolf stepped free in Yellowstone. She was designated Wolf 9F, a female, mature, healthy part of the Rose Creek pack. When the gate of her pen swung open and she moved through it into the open forest, she paused for just a moment. She lifted her nose and read the air around her. She looked at the humans watching from a respectful distance, and then she moved away into the trees with a fluid, unhurried grace and was gone. Wolf 9F had come home, even though she had never been there before. The early weeks were tense for the biologists, monitoring the new packs. Every radio collar signal was tracked. Every movement was mapped. The scientists were watching for everything: aggression between packs, attempts to leave the park, livestock depredation, response to the elk populations that were distributed across the valleys. The wolves surprised them almost immediately, not by doing something dramatic, not by immediately staging spectacular hunts visible to tourists. The wolves surprised the biologists by simply being extraordinarily competent at being wolves. They moved through the landscape with a purposeful confidence that was remarkable for animals in an entirely new environment. They found water. They found shelter. They began exploring their territories with what appeared to be systematic efficiency, marking boundaries, investigating features of the landscape, learning the geography of their new home as if this were something they had always known how to do. Because it was. Wolves have been navigating new landscapes for tens of thousands of years. Their brains are built for it. Their social structures, the pack with its complex hierarchy and its accumulated knowledge transmitted from generation to generation, are adaptations for exactly this kind of challenge. Within weeks, the first pack had made its first major kill: a bull elk, old and carrying the visible weight of age in his slowed gait, taken in the Lamar Valley by what would become known as the Druid Peak Pack, one of the most famous wolf families in the history of wildlife research. The scientists watching from the ridge above felt something shift, not just in the data, but in the landscape itself. Something had changed in the valley below. Something that had been absent for 70 years had returned. And even if you could not yet see the physical changes it would bring, you could sense, in some way, that was difficult to articulate and easy to dismiss as sentimentality, but which turned out to be entirely accurate, that the system was different now. It was whole again, or beginning to be. The effects would not be immediate. Ecosystems do not transform overnight. The changes that had accumulated over 7 decades of wolf absence would not reverse themselves in months. The work of restoration was going to take years, decades, perhaps generations, but it had begun. The first measurable changes were behavioral. Elk distribution shifted almost immediately after wolf packs became established across the park. Areas where elk had previously concentrated for long periods, particularly the valley bottoms and the riparian zones along rivers and streams, began to see reduced elk residency times. It was subtle at first. A herd that had previously grazed a willow flat for days at a time began moving through it in hours. Animals that had bedded along riverbanks began choosing more open terrain where approaching predators could be detected from a greater distance. The behavioral signatures of prey living with an active predator, heightened vigilance, increased movement, avoidance of high-risk terrain began to appear across the landscape. The elk were afraid again, and in their fear, the park was beginning to breathe. The earliest ecological response was a very simple one. In certain places, the young shoots of willows that emerged in spring were not eaten before they could grow beyond browsing height. They survived. The following spring, more survived. And the spring after that, more still. It is difficult to convey how significant this was, because it is so apparently small. A willow shoot surviving the spring. It does not sound like the beginning of a transformation. It sounds like nothing at all. But ecologists who were paying close attention understood what it meant. A willow shoot that survives long enough to grow beyond the reach of browsing elk will become a willow shrub. A willow shrub will become a willow tree. A willow tree will have roots that reach into the riverbank and hold the soil in place. It will have branches that shade the water and cool it in summer. It will have seeds that travel on the wind and establish new plants downstream. It will have bark and leaves that beavers can eat and use to build dams. From one surviving willow shoot, an entire cascade of ecological consequences can flow, but only if it survives. Only if something changes the conditions enough to give it a chance. The wolves had changed the conditions. The beavers returned to Yellowstone so quietly that many people who visited the park in the years just after the wolf reintroduction did not notice. They came back to streams where they had been absent for decades, began felling willows, began carrying sticks and mud to the same locations in the stream bed that beaver populations had used centuries before. Beavers are extraordinary animals. They are, by any objective measure, among the most ecologically powerful, non-human creatures on Earth. A single beaver family, typically consisting of an adult pair and the offspring from the previous 2 breeding seasons, can reshape an entire stretch of stream in ways that alter the hydrology of the surrounding landscape for kilometers in every direction. When a beaver builds a dam, it is not building a wall. It is building a water management system of remarkable sophistication. The dam slows the current, causing sediment to drop out of suspension and accumulate behind the structure. The backed up water spreads laterally into the floodplain, saturating soil that had been dry or only seasonally wet. The water table rises in the surrounding land. Springs that had been intermittent become permanent. Streams that had dried completely in late summer continue to flow. Behind each beaver dam, a pond forms. In each pond, aquatic vegetation takes root. Invertebrates colonize the soft sediment of the pond floor. Amphibians, frogs, and toads and salamanders find in these ponds the shallow, warm, vegetated water they need for breeding. Ducks and other waterfowl arrive to nest in the emergent vegetation along the pond margins. Mink and muskrats move in. Fish, particularly trout, use the cool, deep water behind beaver dams as thermal refugia during the warm months, when stream temperatures in the surrounding unaltered channels rise above comfortable levels. A single beaver pond creates habitat for dozens of species that would not otherwise be present. And in Yellowstone, by the mid-2000s, beaver ponds were appearing along streams that had been devoid of beaver sign for 30 years or more. The hydrological effects were measurable almost immediately. Research teams studying the hydrology of beaver-influenced stream reaches found that peak flows during spring snowmelt were reduced in those reaches because the beaver ponds acted as buffers, storing water during high flow periods and releasing it slowly through the rest of the year. The streams through beaver-modified reaches ran cooler in summer because the ponds created a reservoir of cold groundwater that continued to feed the stream after surface flows decreased. For the fish, this was not a minor improvement. Cutthroat trout, the native trout of Yellowstone, require water temperatures below roughly 20 degrees Celsius to survive. In stretches of river without beaver-maintained cold water refugia, summer temperatures frequently exceeded this threshold during drought years, causing stress and mortality in trout populations. In beaver-influenced reaches, temperatures remained within tolerable limits even during the hottest years on record. The fish responded. Survey data collected by park biologists showed increasing trout populations in streams where beaver had re-established, particularly in reaches that had been among the most thermally stressed before the beavers returned. And the birds followed the fish. The American dipper, a small gray bird that is uniquely adapted to feed underwater in fast-moving streams, had been declining in Yellowstone for years as stream quality deteriorated. With the return of cleaner, colder, more structurally complex streams, dipper populations began recovering in the sections where beavers had been most active. The osprey, which hunts fish by diving from above, began using areas along Yellowstone's rivers that it had previously abandoned. The great blue heron, which requires shallow, calm water to wade and stand and strike at passing fish, found in the beaver ponds exactly the habitat it needed. The list of species that benefited, directly or indirectly, from the return of the beaver, which had itself been made possible by the return of the wolf, grew with each passing year of systematic study. But the most visually dramatic changes were not in the water. They were along its edges. The willows that had begun surviving in wolf-influenced parts of the park grew with the single-minded urgency of plants that have been waiting for an opportunity for decades. By the time the research teams began doing systematic vegetation surveys in the Lamar Valley and other core wolf areas in the mid-2000s, willows and aspens in riparian zones where wolves were present were measurably, substantially taller and denser than those in areas without regular wolf activity. The data was striking. William Ripple and his graduate student Robert Bishcha at Oregon State University spent years carefully documenting these differences using aerial photography, field measurements, and historical records to reconstruct what the vegetation had looked like before. What they found confirmed and quantified what observers on the ground had been noticing qualitatively for years. The willows were growing, the aspens were coming back, and those trees were changing the rivers. A mature willow or aspen on a riverbank does several things simultaneously. Its root system, which in a healthy riparian willow can extend laterally for many meters through the soil near the water, reinforces the bank against erosion. When a flooding river rises and presses against a willow-stabilized bank, the bank resists. The roots hold. The soil stays. Without that reinforcement, a flooding river undercuts its banks, collapsing them and carrying the material away as suspended sediment. The river widens. It becomes shallower. It loses the depth and structural complexity that cold water fish and many aquatic invertebrates require. As the willows grew back in wolf-affected areas of Yellowstone, the rivers in those areas began to narrow slightly and deepen. The banks became more stable. The sinuosity of the channels, the degree to which they curved and meandered through the landscape, increased as the rivers began to do what naturally flowing rivers with stable, vegetated banks do: explore the floodplain, create cut banks and point bars, build the intricate physical structure of a fully functioning river system. Ripple and Bestja described this as the wolves causing physical changes in the river through what they termed a behavior-mediated trophic cascade. The wolves changed elk behavior. Elk behavior change allowed plant growth. Plant growth changed the physical structure of the rivers. This was not metaphor. It was documented, measured, repeatable observation. But the scientific community's response to these findings was not uniform enthusiasm. Science does not work that way. Science works through challenge, replication, critique, and the slow building of consensus through the accumulation of evidence from multiple independent sources. Some researchers pushed back on what they saw as an overly neat narrative. Mark Kaufman and his colleagues at the University of Wyoming raised important questions about whether the magnitude of the vegetation response could really be attributed primarily to wolf-induced changes in elk behavior, or whether other factors, changes in elk population size, changes in climate, the effects of the 1988 Yellowstone fires, were equally or more important. These were legitimate scientific questions, and they mattered because the story of the wolves of Yellowstone was becoming famous. It was being told in viral videos, in documentary films, in magazine articles, and books. It was being held up as evidence for a general principle about the power of trophic cascades and the importance of predator reintroduction as a conservation tool worldwide. If the story was more complicated than the simple narrative suggested, that mattered. Not because the reintroduction had been a failure, but because conservation decisions around the world were being made, in part, on the basis of what Yellowstone seemed to demonstrate. Getting the science right was not just academic, it was practical. What emerged from more than 2 decades of ongoing research was a picture that was more nuanced than either the simple triumphalist narrative or the skeptical counter-narrative. The wolves had clearly changed elk distribution. The evidence for that was strong and well replicated. The change in elk distribution had clearly allowed some vegetation recovery in some areas. The vegetation recovery had clearly had positive effects on beavers, on river morphology, and on aquatic and riparian species in the areas where it had occurred most strongly. But the magnitude and geographic extent of these changes varied considerably across the park. In the Lamar Valley and a few other core wolf territories, the changes were dramatic and well documented. In other parts of the park, where wolf activity was lower or elk density remained high for reasons related to terrain and alternative food availability, the changes were more modest. The full picture was not one of uniform ecosystem transformation. It was one of a complex system responding in variable and sometimes unexpected ways to the reintroduction of a missing element. Some parts of the system snapped back quickly and powerfully. Others responded more slowly. Others appeared to require additional time or additional changes before substantial recovery would be visible. The honest scientific conclusion was both more complicated and more interesting than the simple story. Wolf reintroduction had been an ecological success, and the trophic cascade effects were real and measurable, but the ecosystem was not a machine with a simple switch. It was a living system of almost incomprehensible complexity, responding to the return of the wolf in ways that were broadly consistent with what ecologists had predicted, but that differed in detail and magnitude from place to place and from year to year, which is exactly what you would expect from a wild ecosystem, and which, in its own way, is the most important message of the entire Yellowstone story. The scientists who first began to understand what was happening to Yellowstone did not arrive at their conclusions quickly or easily. Science rarely works that way. It works through accumulation, through the slow gathering of observations that individually seem unremarkable, but that collectively, when someone finally looks at them from the right angle, reveal a pattern that changes everything. The pattern that would eventually lead to the understanding of what Yellowstone had lost, when it lost its wolves, began to emerge in the work of a handful of ecologists working in the 1960s and 1970s who were asking a question that had not been asked seriously before. What exactly do large predators do to the ecosystems they inhabit? This seems like an obvious question in retrospect. But for most of the history of ecology as a formal scientific discipline, the answer had been taken as self-evident and uninteresting. Large predators eat prey animals. They reduce prey populations. They are controlled by prey availability. End of story. The food web was understood as a ladder. Energy entered at the bottom through plants. Herbivores ate the plants. Predators ate the herbivores. The dynamics of the system were driven from the bottom up by the productivity of the plants, which was determined by sunlight, water, and nutrients. The predators at the top were passengers, not drivers. They responded to the system. They did not shape it. This bottom-up view of ecosystem dynamics was not without merit. It captured real aspects of how energy flows through living systems, but it was incomplete in ways that would take decades of careful work to fully expose. The first serious challenge to the latter view came from an unlikely direction: the rocky intertidal zone of the Pacific coast of Washington state. Robert Payne was an ecologist at the University of Washington who, in the early 1960s, began conducting a series of experiments at a place called Mukau Bay on the Olympic Peninsula. Payne was interested in what determined the composition and diversity of the communities of organisms living on the rocks in the intertidal zone, those narrow strips of coast that are alternately covered by the tide and exposed to air. In the intertidal at Mukau Bay, the dominant animal was the ocker sea star, Pisostar ocraceus, a large predatory starfish that fed primarily on mussels. Payne began removing sea stars from experimental plots while leaving adjacent control plots undisturbed. What happened was dramatic and unexpected. In the plots from which sea stars had been removed, mussels rapidly expanded to cover nearly all available rock surface, outcompeting and eliminating most of the other species that had previously occupied those plots. The diversity of species in the experimental plots collapsed from around 15 species to essentially 1. In the control plots, where sea stars remained, the community maintained its diversity. The sea stars kept the mussels in check, preventing any single species from monopolizing the space and allowing the full diversity of the intertidal community to persist. Payne coined a term for animals like the sea star, species whose influence on their ecosystem was grossly disproportionate to their abundance. Keystone species. The image was architectural. The keystone of an arch is not the largest stone, not the most numerous stone, not even necessarily the most visible stone, but remove it and the structure fails. The keystone is the piece on which the coherence of everything else depends. The keystone species concept was a revolution in how ecologists thought about the structure of communities and ecosystems. It provided a theoretical framework for understanding something that had been observed in various places but never coherently explained, that the removal of certain species, particularly large predators, had effects on ecosystems that were far out of proportion to the simple subtraction of one consumer from a food web. Payne's work was followed by a cascade of research from other ecologists studying other systems. In freshwater lakes, the removal of large predatory fish caused increases in smaller fish that in turn grazed down the zooplankton that fed on algae, causing algal blooms that reduced water clarity and oxygen levels. In terrestrial systems, the exclusion of large herbivores from experimental plots produced dramatic changes in plant community composition. In marine systems, the depletion of large sharks caused increases in their prey species, which in turn caused overgrazing of seagrass beds and kelp forests. Everywhere scientists looked, once they knew what to look for, they found evidence of what they began calling trophic cascades, the propagation of the effects of changes at one level of a food web through multiple levels, often in ways that were counterintuitive and that could only be understood by thinking about the entire system rather than any individual part of it. The concept of the trophic cascade was formally articulated by Nelson Hairston, Frederick Smith, and Lawrence Slobodkin in a landmark 1960 paper, and developed further by subsequent researchers, including Payne and later by James Estes, whose long-term studies of sea otters and kelp forest ecosystems in the Aleutian Islands would become one of the most compelling demonstrations of trophic cascade dynamics in any ecosystem. Estes had begun studying sea otters along the Aleutian chain in the 1970s. Sea otters eat sea urchins. Sea otters eat sea urchins. Eat kelp. In areas where sea otters were abundant, sea urchin populations were kept low, kelp forests were dense and structurally complex, and the associated fish and invertebrate communities were diverse and productive. In areas where sea otters were absent, sea urchins proliferated, grazing the kelp down to bare rock, creating what ecologists called urchin barrens, underwater deserts where the collapsed kelp forest had been replaced by a monoculture of grazing sea urchins. The sea otters were the keystone of the kelp forest ecosystem. When they were present, the cascade ran. Otters suppressed urchins. Urchins released. Kelp forest sustained diversity. When they were absent, the cascade reversed. Urchins exploded. Kelp disappeared. Diversity collapsed. Estes would later observe, across decades of monitoring, something even more disturbing. In parts of the Aleutians, where killer whales had begun preying on sea otters, presumably because their preferred prey of whales and stellar sea lions had been depleted by hunting and competition with commercial fishing, otter populations collapsed, urchin barrens expanded, and the kelp forest ecosystem entered a state of severe degradation. The killer whale, by preying on the otter, had triggered a cascade that ran from the top predator all the way down to the kelp. A chain of 4 links, killer whale to otter to urchin to kelp, connected the apex of the marine food web to the foundation of one of the ocean's most productive ecosystems. These were not isolated observations from unusual systems. By the 1980s, similar patterns had been documented in lakes, rivers, grasslands, forests, estuaries, and coral reefs. on every continent. The evidence was converging on a conclusion that fundamentally challenged the bottom-up view of ecosystem dynamics that had dominated ecology for decades. Ecosystems were not simply driven by the productivity of their plant base. They were shaped from both ends simultaneously, from the bottom up by the flow of energy through the food web, and from the top down by the behavior-modifying and population-regulating effects of large predators. Remove the top, and the effects propagated downward through the system just as powerfully as the removal of the bottom would propagate upward. The ecologists developing this framework had a name for it: top-down regulation. And as the evidence accumulated, it became increasingly clear that top-down regulation was not a curiosity of a few unusual ecosystems. It was a universal feature of how living systems maintained their structure and function. This had profound implications for how we should think about the consequences of predator removal. If large predators were keystone species in virtually every ecosystem where they occurred, then the global campaign of predator elimination that human civilization had been conducting for centuries, killing wolves, lions, tigers, sharks, bears, eagles, and every other large predator that threatened livestock or competed with hunters, was not simply a loss of charismatic animals. It was a systematic dismantling of the regulatory mechanisms that kept ecosystems functional. The scientists who understood this were, by the 1980s, genuinely alarmed. Not in a performative or political way, but in the straightforward way that a doctor is alarmed when they recognize symptoms of a serious illness in a patient who does not yet know they are sick. The patient was every ecosystem from which large predators had been removed, which meant most of the land surface of the earth. But the alarm was difficult to communicate beyond the scientific community for several reasons that are worth examining carefully. The first was the problem of scale. The effects of predator removal operated over timescales that exceeded human memory and over spatial scales that exceeded direct human perception. A person living near Yellowstone in 1960 could not see the difference between what the park's riparian zones looked like then and what they had looked like in 1900, before the wolves were gone. The change had been too gradual, too spread out, too masked by year-to-year and decade-to-decade variation in rainfall and temperature and other factors. You needed long-term systematic data, the kind of data that scientific monitoring programs produce over decades, to see the trend through the noise. The second problem was counterfactual reasoning. To understand what predator removal has done to an ecosystem, you need to be able to compare the ecosystem as it currently exists with how it would have looked if the predators had never been removed. That comparison cannot be made directly. There is no Yellowstone without wolf removal as a control case against which to measure the actual Yellowstone. The counterfactual has to be inferred from a combination of historical records, comparison with other systems, and theoretical modeling, all of which are imperfect and all of which are subject to challenge. Ecologists who argued that the degraded state of Yellowstone's riparian zones was a consequence of wolf removal were making an argument that was scientifically sound, but that rested on inference and comparison rather than direct experimental proof. Their opponents could always point to other possible explanations for the observed changes: climate variation, disease in elk populations, changes in grazing patterns caused by human activity along the park's borders, the effects of the 1988 fires that burned large portions of the park. Some of these alternative explanations had merit. The real world is complex, and multiple factors were indeed operating simultaneously on the Yellowstone ecosystem. The challenge was not to prove that wolves were the only factor, which was never claimed, but to demonstrate that wolves were a significant factor, significant enough that their absence could reasonably be expected to account for a substantial portion of the observed degradation. Making that demonstration required exactly the kind of long-term and large-scale, carefully controlled research that is extraordinarily difficult to conduct in wild ecosystems, and that takes decades to produce results convincing enough to build consensus around. The third problem was the gap between ecological understanding and public and political understanding, even when the science was clear within the community of ecologists. Translating that clarity into terms that were accessible and meaningful to non-scientists, to ranchers and hunters and politicians and the general public required a kind of communication that scientists are often poorly trained for and frequently uncomfortable with. Scientists are trained to qualify, to hedge, to acknowledge uncertainty, to present results with error bars and confidence intervals and lists of alternative explanations. These are virtues in a scientific paper where precision and honesty about uncertainty are essential. They are often liabilities in public communication, where audiences are looking for clear, confident, actionable conclusions, and where the constant qualification of every statement can be mistaken for fundamental uncertainty about everything. The ecologists who were most effective at communicating the case for wolf reintroduction were those who had learned to translate complex, qualified scientific findings into compelling and accurate narratives without sacrificing the essential honesty of the underlying science. This is a genuinely difficult skill. It requires understanding not just the science, but the psychology of how people receive and process information about the natural world. One of the people who was most effective at this translation was a biologist named Michael Solé, who in the 1980s was developing the theoretical foundations of what he called conservation biology, the application of ecological science to the practical challenge of preserving biological diversity in a world increasingly dominated by human activity. Solé argued that conservation biology needed to be explicit about its value commitments in a way that basic ecological science was not. Ecology could describe how ecosystems worked. Conservation biology needed to make the case for why the functioning of ecosystems mattered, needed to connect the abstract findings of trophic cascade research to the concrete human interest in maintaining a living world capable of supporting civilization. The argument Solé and his colleagues developed was deceptively simple in outline. Wild ecosystems provide services, not in the metaphorical sense, but in the literal economic sense, that human civilization depends on: clean water, stable soils, climate regulation, disease control, pollination of crops. These services are produced by the functional processes of healthy ecosystems, processes that depend on the full complement of species, including the large predators that regulate everything below them. Remove the predators, and the services degrade along with the ecosystem that produces them. The degradation may be slow and invisible at first, but it accumulates, and at some point, the accumulated degradation becomes a crisis that is both ecological and economic, a crisis that affects not just the wolves or the elk or the willows along the river, but the water downstream, the soil stability, the disease dynamics of wildlife populations that interact with domestic animals, the climate stability of a planet that depends on the carbon sequestration capacity of intact ecosystems. This framework made the case for wolf conservation not as a matter of sentiment or aesthetics, but as a matter of pragmatic self-interest. You do not need to love wolves to have a stake in their existence. You need only to drink water, to live in a climate that is not spiraling out of control, to depend on agriculture that requires pollination and healthy soil. The argument was powerful. It was also, in the context of the wolf reintroduction debate, often drowned out by the more immediate and more emotionally resonant arguments about livestock losses and hunting traditions and federal overreach. Because the services that healthy ecosystems provide are invisible in the same way that the mechanisms that produce them are invisible. You can see a wolf kill a calf. You cannot see the carbon that is not being sequestered because the willows along the river are being eaten before they can grow. You cannot see the groundwater that is not being recharged because the beavers are gone. You cannot see the disease that spreads more rapidly through an elk herd because there are no predators selecting out the sick individuals. The visible costs of wolf presence are immediate and local. The invisible costs of wolf absence are diffuse and cumulative and spread across time and space in ways that no individual person experiences directly. This asymmetry between the visibility of costs and the invisibility of benefits is one of the fundamental structural challenges of environmental conservation, and it goes far beyond the specific case of wolves. It explains why it is politically easy to drain a wetland and politically hard to protect one, why it is easy to approve a mine and hard to preserve the watershed the mine will affect, why the people who bear the immediate costs of conservation are rarely the same people who receive the diffuse and long-term benefits. The wolf reintroduction debate was, among other things, a particularly vivid illustration of this structural challenge. The ranchers who feared livestock losses were being asked to bear immediate and concrete costs so that an ecosystem could provide benefits that would be diffuse, long-term, and largely experienced by people who had no stake in the ranching economy. From their perspective, this was fundamentally unfair. And from a narrow economic perspective, they were not wrong. The question of how to make conservation fair, how to distribute the costs and benefits of maintaining wild ecosystems in ways that do not simply impose sacrifices on already vulnerable communities, is one that the conservation movement has struggled with for its entire history and has not yet fully resolved. What the Yellowstone reintroduction did, imperfectly and incompletely, but genuinely, was create mechanisms to partially address this unfairness: compensation programs for livestock losses, funding for non-lethal deterrence, the economic benefits of wolf-watching tourism that began to flow into communities that had previously seen only costs. These were not full solutions. They were first steps toward a model of conservation that took seriously the interests of the human communities living alongside wild animals. That model continues to evolve. The lessons of Yellowstone have informed wolf and large carnivore management efforts around the world. Some of those efforts have succeeded. Some have failed. The pattern of what makes the difference between success and failure is becoming clearer with each iteration. The ecosystems that have shown the most successful recovery after predator reintroduction are those where the reintroduction was accompanied by serious engagement with local communities, by transparent science communication, by fair compensation mechanisms, and by management frameworks flexible enough to adapt to unexpected outcomes. The ecosystems where reintroduction has failed or been reversed are typically those where the human dimensions were neglected, where local opposition was dismissed rather than engaged, where the science was oversimplified in ways that made the program politically vulnerable when the inevitable complications arose. This pattern tells us something important about how conservation must work in the 21st century. It cannot be imposed. It cannot be done to communities. It must be done with them in a process of negotiation and compromise that is messier and slower and less satisfying to everyone, than a purely scientific or purely economic solution would be. But that is the only approach that produces outcomes that endure. The wolves of Yellowstone survived their first decade and their second and their third, not only because they were biologically successful, not only because they transformed the ecosystem around them in ways that generated public support, but because the people who had worked for years to make the reintroduction possible had invested in the human relationships and the institutional structures that gave the wolves a chance to demonstrate what they could do. That investment was itself a kind of science, a social science, a science of how human beings manage their relationship with the natural world. And it is no less important than the ecological science of trophic cascades and keystone species, even if it generates far fewer viral videos and far less public excitement. There is another dimension of the Yellowstone story that the focus on trophic cascades and ecosystem recovery tends to obscure, and it is a dimension that may ultimately be as important as any of the biological details. The return of the wolves changed how people experience Yellowstone. This sounds like a small thing. It is not. Yellowstone had always been spectacular. The geysers, the hot springs, the bison herds, the bears, the mountains and the rivers and the open grasslands. Before the wolves returned, the park drew millions of visitors annually, and most of those visitors left feeling that they had seen something extraordinary. But there is a quality of experience available in Yellowstone since 1995 that was not available before. A quality that is difficult to name, but that people who have felt it describe in remarkably consistent terms. It is the experience of wildness, not the experience of beauty, which was always there, not the experience of spectacle, but the experience of being in a place where the fundamental processes of nature are operating fully and freely, where the top of the food chain is present and active, where the animals you are watching are genuinely wild in the deepest sense, shaped by real predation pressure, living real lives of genuine risk, not performers in a managed landscape, but participants in a drama that has been running for millions of years. The wolf watchers who gather in the Lamar Valley in the pre-dawn dark of winter mornings with their expensive spotting scopes and their sleeping bags and their thermoses of coffee are not simply wildlife tourists seeking a visual experience. They are people in search of something that is increasingly rare in a world from which wildness is being steadily subtracted. They are seeking contact with the real, with the unmanaged, with the processes that existed before human civilization, and that will persist if we allow them to, long after it. The word for what they are seeking is hard to pin down in English. Other languages have better words. The Germans have wildness, which means something more than simply wilderness, more like the quality of being genuinely wild rather than the space where wild things live. The Japanese have Satoyama, which describes the zone of contact between human culture and wild nature, a concept that acknowledges both the distinction and the connection. In English, the closest we have is probably wildness, in the sense that Henry David Thoreau meant when he wrote that, in wildness is the preservation of the world, not wilderness as a geographic designation. Wildness as a quality of experience, as a way of being present in a place that reminds you that you are not the author of everything around you. The return of the wolves to Yellowstone restored a degree of wildness to the park that it had been missing for 70 years. And the human response to that restoration, the millions of people who came to watch wolves, the outpouring of public interest and emotional investment in the lives of individual animals, the global spread of the story through films and articles and social media suggests that the appetite for that experience is far larger than most land managers and conservation policymakers had previously assumed. This has practical implications that go beyond Yellowstone. If wildness, the presence of complete, functioning ecosystems with their full complement of species, including large predators, generates significant human value in the form of tourism, of psychological well-being, of cultural meaning, then the economic calculus of conservation changes. The case for preserving large predators and wild ecosystems has typically been made in terms of abstract ecological benefits, carbon sequestration, watershed protection, disease regulation, services that are real but that are difficult to monetize and that accrue to diffuse and distributed beneficiaries. But the experience of wildness is something that people will pay for, travel for, and advocate for with a passion that they do not bring to the defense of carbon sequestration. The wolf-watching economy of the greater Yellowstone region generates real, measurable, annually recurring economic value for the communities around the park. Hotels fill, restaurants are patronized, guide services employ local people, fuel is bought. This does not eliminate the conflict with ranching interests. Nothing eliminates that conflict entirely, because some wolves will always kill some livestock, and some ranchers will always bear costs that the broader benefits of wolf presence do not compensate in any direct economic sense. But it does change the overall economic picture of wolf presence in the landscape, from a story in which wolves impose costs on ranching communities and provide benefits only to distant ecologists and urban environmentalists, to a story in which wolves impose costs on some sectors of the local economy while providing benefits to others, creating a more complex and more negotiable economic landscape. The wolves of Yellowstone did not just restore an ecological process. They restored an economic possibility that had not existed before. The possibility of building a regional economy partly around the presence of wild predators. This is a model that is now being explored in many places around the world, in the Scottish Highlands, in Scandinavia, in parts of Africa and Asia, where communities adjacent to wildlife reserves are seeking ways to derive economic benefit from the animals that in the past represented only costs and dangers. It is not a perfect model. It requires infrastructure, investment, management, and a landscape capable of supporting the wildlife that attracts visitors. It is not applicable everywhere, but where it works, it creates economic incentives for conservation that are more durable than regulatory protection alone, because they align the interests of local communities with the persistence of wild animals rather than against it. The wolves did not intend any of this. They did not intend to restore the rivers, or the willows, or the beavers, or the trout, or the regional tourist economy. They intended, insofar as wolves intend anything, to find prey and survive and raise pups and hold their territory against rival packs. But the consequences of their survival radiated outward in every direction, through every trophic level of the ecosystem, through the hydrology of the rivers, through the structure of the forest, through the economic and cultural life of the surrounding communities, and through the global conversation about what it means to live on a planet that is increasingly shaped by human decisions. Those consequences are still accumulating. The wolves are still there. The research programs that have been monitoring the ecosystem since 1995 are still running, still generating data, still finding new things to add to the picture. The picture is not complete. It will not be complete for decades. It may never be complete, because complete understanding of a living ecosystem of this complexity is probably beyond what any human institution or any generation of scientists can achieve. But the picture is clear enough to draw some conclusions. clear enough to say with confidence that the return of the wolves to Yellowstone was among the most instructive ecological events of the 20th century. Clear enough to say that what happened in the Lamar Valley after 1995 changed how we understand the relationship between predators and ecosystems. Clear enough to say that the lessons of Yellowstone are relevant not just to this one park in Wyoming, but to every wild place on Earth where the question of whether to restore or protect large predators is being asked, and clear enough to say that the answer to that question, wherever it is being asked, should begin with what happened here, with the willows growing back, with the beavers building dams in streams where they had been absent for 30 years, with the rivers running cooler and cleaner and more structurally complex than they had in living memory, with the eagles overhead and the trout in the cold pools and the grizzlies feeding on wolf kills in the deep winter, with everything that was absent. And then, because 14 wolves crossed a border in wooden crates on a cold January morning, present again. While scientists debated the mechanisms and measured the details, something else was happening in Yellowstone that nobody had fully anticipated. The wolves were becoming celebrities. Wolf watching had existed as a niche activity in the wildlife observation world before the reintroduction. A small community of dedicated naturalists had spent years following wolves in places like Minnesota's Boundary Waters or the wilderness areas of Idaho and Montana. But those were remote, difficult places inaccessible to most people, where wolves were rarely seen in daylight. Yellowstone was different. The Lamar Valley in particular, a broad, open grassland valley bordered by ridges from which observers could see across large distances, became within just a few years of the reintroduction one of the finest places on Earth to watch wolves in the wild. People came, first in small numbers, the dedicated wildlife watchers with their spotting scopes and their patience, then in larger numbers as word spread about what could be seen in the valley on winter mornings and summer evenings. Then, in numbers that genuinely surprised the Park Service and everyone else involved. By the early 2000s, wolf watching was generating significant economic activity in the communities surrounding Yellowstone. Biologists estimated that the wolves were worth tens of millions of dollars annually to the regional economy through the spending of wildlife tourists on hotels, food, fuel, guide services, and equipment. The ranching communities that had fought hardest against the reintroduction found themselves in an uncomfortable position. The wolves they had feared were drawing tourists whose spending supported local businesses. The economic calculation had become more complex than anyone had expected. But the livestock depredation problem had not gone away. Wolves did kill cattle and sheep outside the park boundaries, not in catastrophic numbers, but in numbers that were real and painful to the individual families affected. A rancher who loses 12 calves to wolves in a single summer has lost something significant, regardless of the statistical rarity of such events. The compensation programs that had been established before the reintroduction helped, but they were imperfect, proving that livestock deaths were caused by wolves rather than other predators, or disease required documentation that was not always available. Compensation, when it came, arrived weeks or months after the loss, and it could not replace the anxiety of not knowing whether your cattle were safe on the range. Non-lethal deterrence, methods livestock guardian dogs, range riders who monitored cattle on remote grazing allotments, electric fencing around calving areas were promoted and subsidized by conservation organizations that had supported the reintroduction and felt a responsibility to help the communities most affected by it. Some of these methods were effective, some were costly, and impractical in the vast open landscapes of the Mountain West. The relationship between wolves and ranching was not solved by the reintroduction. It entered a new and more complicated phase. The legal battles over the wolves' protected status intensified as the population grew and as wolves began to be documented outside the park in areas where hunting remained an important cultural and economic activity. Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho pushed repeatedly for the authority to manage wolves under state hunting regulations, which would include hunting seasons that could reduce population numbers. Environmental organizations fought back in the courts, arguing that the wolf population remained too vulnerable to lose federal protection. The resulting legal battles dragged on for years, creating uncertainty for ranchers, hunters, wildlife managers, and everyone else who had a stake in the wolves' future. In 2011, federal wolf protections were removed through a legislative rider attached to a budget bill, the first time in United States history that a species had been removed from Endangered Species Act protection through legislation rather than through the scientific review process. Wolf hunting seasons opened in Montana and Idaho within months. The controversy this created in the conservation community was intense. Many scientists argued that the populations, while growing, were still not large enough or genetically diverse enough to withstand the mortality that hunting would add to the natural causes of wolf death. Others argued that state management, if conducted responsibly, could maintain wolf populations while reducing the conflict with livestock and hunting interests that had made the wolves' political position so precarious. The debate continues to this day. Wolf populations in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and across the northern Rockies have fluctuated with changes in legal status, state hunting regulations, and the underlying dynamics of prey availability and territorial conflict between packs. The wolves are present. The ecosystem may have helped to change, continues to respond, but their long-term security is not guaranteed. This uncertainty is uncomfortable because the story of the wolves of Yellowstone is so often told as a story of triumph, of restoration, of nature correcting itself once humans get out of the way. And in important ways, it is that story. But it is also a story about how complicated it is to coexist with large predators in a landscape that is also home to human communities with legitimate economic interests and deeply held cultural values. About how conservation cannot succeed if it ignores those communities or about how the biology of recovery and the politics of recovery are both essential and are almost never synchronized. The wolves of Yellowstone did not return to a wilderness that belonged to nobody. They returned to a landscape that was embedded in a web of human interests, legal frameworks, economic dependencies, and emotional attachments that the science of trophic cascades had nothing to say about. Managing that complexity, finding a way for wolves and ranches and hunters and ecotourists and beaver colonies and trout streams to coexist in the same landscape has been and will continue to be among the most difficult challenges in the history of American conservation. It has not been perfectly done. Important mistakes have been made on all sides. People have been hurt economically and have felt dismissed and overruled. Wildlife has suffered from political decisions made for reasons having nothing to do with ecology. But the wolves are still there, and what they have done to the landscape around them is still happening, still accumulating, still unfolding in ways that scientists are still working to fully understand. What the wolves of Yellowstone have taught us about predators is profound and far-reaching, and it goes well beyond the specific details of willows growing and beavers building dams in a single park in Wyoming. Across the world, there is now a substantial and growing body of scientific evidence showing that the removal of large predators from ecosystems causes predictable and serious cascading effects throughout those systems. This phenomenon, described by Joel Berger of the Wildlife Conservation Society as a global crisis of trophic downgrading, has been documented on every continent and in marine, freshwater, and terrestrial ecosystems. Where wolves and other large predators have been removed, prey populations grow beyond what the land can sustainably support. Vegetation is degraded. Smaller predators that were previously suppressed by the larger ones proliferate and affect prey communities in ways that large predators did not. The physical structure of landscapes, the shape of rivers, the composition of forests, the distribution of wetlands changes in ways that reduce biological diversity and ecosystem function. The Yellowstone wolves did not demonstrate a new principle. They demonstrated a principle that had been operating everywhere, invisibly, for as long as ecosystems had contained large predators. What Yellowstone provided was a natural experiment of rare clarity, a well-documented before, a dramatic and carefully monitored reintroduction, and decades of systematic scientific study of the after. The result was not the complete confirmation of any single simple hypothesis. It was something more valuable, a case study of almost incomprehensible richness that revealed the interconnectedness of a living system in ways that purely theoretical work could never have achieved. Ecologists studying large carnivore ecosystems in Africa, where lions and leopards and wild dogs play roles ecologically analogous to wolves in North America, have found similar patterns. Where large predators persist in sufficient numbers, prey animals behave differently, using the landscape in more distributed and variable ways, reducing the overgrazing pressure that degrades vegetation and destabilizes soils. Where large predators have been eliminated or reduced, the landscape shows the same signatures of trophic downgrading that were documented in Yellowstone before 1995. In the ocean, the story is, if anything, more dramatic. Shark populations have declined by more than 70% across much of the world ocean due to overfishing and the shark fin trade. Where sharks are absent, the fish and marine mammals they previously hunted have increased in some places, and the behavioral changes in prey species have allowed overgrazing of kelp forests and seagrass beds, causing the collapse of some of the ocean's most productive ecosystems. The whales, killed in their tens of millions during the 20th century, had fertilized the surface ocean with their feces, delivering nutrients from depth where they fed to the sunlit surface where phytoplankton grew. Those phytoplankton captured carbon from the atmosphere. The killing of the whales reduced this biological pump, contributing, in ways that are still being quantified, to the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Every large animal removed from a wild ecosystem is not merely a loss of beauty or a loss of biodiversity in the narrow sense. It is the removal of a functional component of a system that has been shaped by the presence of that animal for millions of years. The consequences propagate through the system in ways that are often invisible until enough time has passed for them to accumulate to detectable levels, by which time the damage can be severe. The argument over wolves was never really about wolves. That is the first thing you need to understand if you want to make sense of the decades of conflict that preceded the reintroduction. The wolf was a symbol before it was a biological reality in this debate, a symbol that different communities loaded with completely different meanings. And those meanings were so divergent that the two sides were often, without fully realizing it, arguing about entirely different things. For the ranching families of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho, the wolf was a symbol of loss, of a way of life already under pressure from drought, from falling commodity prices, from the consolidation of agricultural land into fewer and larger operations, from the sense that the rural West was being slowly emptied of the people and traditions that had built it. The wolf was not just an animal that might kill their cattle. It was the latest and most vivid manifestation of a feeling that the land they had lived on for generations was being taken from them, not by force, but by the gradual accumulation of federal regulations and outside opinions about how the land should be used. For the urban environmentalists who championed the reintroduction, the wolf was a symbol of something almost opposite. It was a symbol of wildness, of the authentic nature that industrial civilization had suppressed and that needed to be restored. It was a symbol of the possibility that human beings could correct the mistakes of the past, could undo damage, rather than simply do more of it. The wolf made people feel that the story of humanity and nature did not have to be a one-way trajectory toward diminishment. Neither of these symbolic frameworks was wrong. Exactly. But neither was sufficient to understand what was actually at stake, which was a complex ecological, economic, social, and political question that required far more nuance than any symbol could carry. The history of how those two symbolic frameworks clashed and eventually reached something like a partial accommodation is a history that tells us as much about American society as it does about wolves or ecology. It is a history of power, of who gets to make decisions about shared landscapes, of how scientific evidence does and does not translate into public policy, and of how people negotiate the profound difficulty of living with consequences they did not choose. Doug Smith, the biologist who would become the public face of the Yellowstone Wolf Project, has spent decades thinking about this. In interviews over the years, he has consistently returned to the same point, that the reintroduction could not be understood purely as a scientific triumph. It was also a human story, a story about people who wanted incompatible things from the same landscape, and about the imperfect processes through which democratic societies try to resolve that kind of conflict. The conflict had deep roots. To understand how deep, you have to go back further than the 1970s or the 1980s, back to the fundamental assumptions about the American West that had shaped policy in the region since the 19th century. The American West was settled under a set of assumptions that were coherent and internally consistent, even if they were ecologically catastrophic. The land was vast and the resources were abundant, and the purpose of settlement was to convert those resources into economic productivity. The wilderness was an obstacle to be overcome, not a value to be preserved. The wild animals were either useful as game animals for food or harmful as predators that competed with domestic livestock and should be managed accordingly. These assumptions were not the product of malice or stupidity. They were rational responses to the circumstances of the time, the need to feed a rapidly growing population, the genuine hardship of frontier life, the very real danger that large predators represented to the livestock operations that were the economic backbone of the region. But those assumptions became embedded in institutions, in laws, in agencies, in cultural practices, in the identity of communities that had been built around them. And institutions, laws, agencies, cultural practices, and identities do not change easily or quickly, even when the assumptions that created them have been overtaken by new knowledge or new circumstances. The federal predator control programs that eliminated wolves from Yellowstone and from most of the American West were not aberrations. They were the systematic expression of those embedded assumptions carried out by professional government agencies with the full support of the communities they served. The people who set the poison baits and laid the steel traps were not doing something that their society regarded as wrong. They were doing their jobs. They were serving what everyone agreed was the public interest. To argue for wolf reintroduction in the 1970s and 1980s was therefore not simply to argue for a change in policy. It was to argue that the foundational assumptions of more than a century of Western land management had been wrong, that the great campaign of predator elimination had not been an act of progress, but an act of destruction, that the communities built around those assumptions had been, however inadvertently, participants in an ecological catastrophe. This is not a comfortable argument to make to the people whose grandparents were those participants, and it was not made comfortably or always tactfully. Some of the advocates for wolf reintroduction brought to the debate a tone of moral superiority that made the opposition angrier and more entrenched than it might otherwise have been. Some of the rhetoric from the conservation community characterized ranchers and hunters as backward opponents of science and progress, a characterization that was both inaccurate and deeply counterproductive. The ranchers and hunters, for their part, brought their own rhetorical excesses to the table. The wolf was characterized in some quarters as a merciless killer, as a threat not only to livestock, but to human safety, as a creature that had been deliberately chosen by distant elites to destroy the rural way of life. Some of this language was cynically deployed for political effect. Some of it reflected genuine fear. None of it advanced the conversation. In between these two poles, there were people on both sides who were trying to have a more nuanced and productive conversation. Scientists who acknowledged the real economic concerns of ranching communities. Ranchers who understood, sometimes reluctantly, that the land was changing and that the old management approaches were not working. Conservation organizations that invested in compensation programs and non-lethal deterrence tools, not because they were required to, but because they understood that the reintroduction would fail politically if it was seen as imposing costs on rural communities without any regard for those costs. These were the people who made the reintroduction possible, not the loudest voices on either side, but the quieter ones in the middle who were willing to acknowledge complexity and to look for solutions that were less than perfect, but more than nothing. One of the most important of these individuals was Hank Fisher, a field representative for Defenders of Wildlife who spent years in Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho building relationships with ranching communities that had every reason to distrust him and his organization. Fisher understood that the wolf debate would not be resolved by science alone, that the communities who would live with the consequences of wolf reintroduction had to feel that their concerns were taken seriously and that there were real mechanisms to address their losses. Fisher was the architect of the Defenders of Wildlife Compensation Program, which committed the organization to paying ranchers for documented livestock losses to wolves. It was not a perfect solution. It was administratively complicated. It could not compensate for the stress and anxiety of knowing that wolves were present near your livestock. It could not replace an animal that had sentimental as well as economic value, but it was a concrete acknowledgement that the reintroduction imposed real costs on real people and that those people had a right to expect that those costs would be addressed. The compensation program did not eliminate opposition to the reintroduction. Nothing could have done that, but it reduced the credibility of the argument that conservation organizations wanted wolves without being willing to bear any of the consequences. It demonstrated that at least some of the advocates for reintroduction understood that they were not simply pursuing an abstract ecological ideal, but were making a policy decision with real human costs attached. At the same time, inside the National Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service, a generation of biologists and managers was working on the scientific and logistical challenges of actually carrying out a reintroduction if and when it received political authorization. The science was advancing rapidly. Studies of wolf ecology in Minnesota, where a population had survived the extermination campaigns of the early 20th century, were providing detailed information about wolf social behavior, territory size, prey selection, and the conditions under which wolf populations could be expected to establish and grow. Research on wolf populations in Canada and Alaska was adding to this picture. By the early 1990s, the scientific case for reintroduction was robust. The biological questions had largely been answered. The Fish and Wildlife Service had completed a formal recovery plan for the northern Rocky Mountain gray wolf, and that plan identified Yellowstone as the most suitable and most important site for What remained was the political authorization, and getting that authorization required navigating a congressional process that was deeply influenced by the senators and representatives from Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho, most of whom were under intense pressure from their constituents to block the reintroduction. The congressional battles were extraordinary. Senator Alan Simpson of Wyoming was among the most vocal opponents. He argued that the federal government had no right to impose wolves on a state that did not want them, that the economic costs to ranching communities would be severe and long-lasting, and that the reintroduction was an example of federal overreach at its worst. Supporters of the reintroduction in Congress, led by figures like Representative Wayne Gilchrist of Maryland and Senator Max Baucus of Montana, who broke with much of his state's establishment on this issue, argued that Yellowstone was a national park, a national treasure, and that the federal government had both the right and the responsibility to manage it in accordance with the best available science. The debate in Congress mirrored the debate in the public hearings. It was passionate, often personal, and frequently disconnected from the actual biological and ecological details of what was being proposed. Senators who had never visited Yellowstone and who knew little about wolf ecology made speeches about the threat to ranching. Environmental advocates who knew the science in detail sometimes struggled to communicate it effectively to politicians whose primary concern was the next election. The legal framework that eventually made the reintroduction possible was a compromise. The wolves were designated as a non-essential experimental population under Section 10(j) of the Endangered Species Act. This designation gave wildlife managers more flexibility in responding to wolves that killed livestock, including the authority to remove or kill individual wolves that caused repeated depredation problems. The non-essential experimental designation was deeply controversial among conservation advocates who felt it weakened the legal protection that wolves needed, and their concern was not entirely unfounded. A wolf designated as non-essential experimental has a different legal status than a wolf listed as threatened or endangered, and in the years following the reintroduction, that difference in legal status would matter enormously as conflicts between wolves and livestock operations played out across the landscape outside the park. But without the non-essential experimental designation, there would have been no reintroduction. The political conditions did not exist for a full Endangered Species Act listing for Yellowstone wolves in 1994. The choice was between an imperfect reintroduction and no reintroduction at all. The Fish and Wildlife Service made the decision to proceed. In retrospect, given what happened to the ecosystem after the wolves returned, it is difficult to argue that the decision was wrong. While the political battle was being fought in Washington and in the state capitals of the Mountain West, in the field something else was happening that would prove essential to the success of the reintroduction: the search for the wolves themselves. The reintroduction plan called for sourcing wolves from the Canadian Rockies, where populations were healthy and the wolves were large enough and behaviorally suited to prey on the large elk populations of Yellowstone. The Canadian wolves were considered biologically superior to the much smaller Mexican gray wolf, which was the only other candidate population for the specific ecological conditions of Yellowstone. The capture operation in Canada was led by Canadian wildlife biologist Mike Jimenez, working in cooperation with Parks Canada and the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. Capture teams worked through the fall and early winter of 1994 and early 1995, setting foot snares in carefully chosen locations in the Jasper and Banff area and nearby wilderness corridors. Capturing a wolf is not a simple matter. Wolves are intelligent, highly sensory animals with a long evolutionary history of avoiding human traps. A wolf that encounters the scent of a human on or near a trap will frequently avoid it entirely or investigate it from a distance without approaching close enough to trigger the mechanism. Successful wolf trapping requires the kind of detailed knowledge of individual animal behavior and travel patterns that takes years of fieldwork to develop. The capture teams minimized their scent signature at trap sites, used lures derived from wolf-relevant odors, and chose locations on well-used travel corridors based on months of track and sign surveys. Even so, the capture rate was far lower than the teams had hoped in the early weeks. Wolves that had been photographed or tracked repeatedly near trap sites simply did not walk into the snares. When wolves were finally captured, they were handled with extreme care. Sedation was administered, blood samples were taken, the animals were measured and weighed and assessed for overall health condition. Each wolf was fitted with a radio collar that would allow its movements to be tracked after release. Males and females were sorted into groups that would maximize the potential for pack formation in Yellowstone. Not all the wolves that were captured were ultimately transported to Yellowstone. Animals that showed signs of health problems or that did not fit the genetic or social profile needed for successful pack formation were released at their capture sites in Canada. The 14 individuals that made the January 1995 journey south had been selected with considerable care. The journey itself was logistically complex. The wolves traveled in insulated wooden transport crates designed to minimize stress while providing adequate ventilation and temperature control. The convoy was escorted by law enforcement, both to protect against any attempt to interfere with the transport and to ensure that the high-profile nature of the operation did not create a spectacle that would add additional stress to the already stressed animals. At the Montana border, the convoy was met by Fish and Wildlife Service personnel who would oversee the final leg of the journey into Yellowstone. The animals had been in transit for many hours by the time they crossed the border, and the biologists monitoring them were watching carefully for signs of excessive stress or health deterioration. The wolves were held overnight at a facility near the park boundary before being transported the following day to the acclimation pens that had been constructed inside the park in the preceding months. The acclimation pens were a critical element of the reintroduction strategy. Earlier wolf reintroduction attempts in other locations had used a hard release approach, simply opening the transport crates at the release site and letting the wolves run. The results had been mixed. Some animals had dispersed widely and quickly, moving far outside the intended release area before establishing territories. Others had shown signs of extreme disorientation that compromised their ability to hunt effectively in the weeks immediately following release. The soft release approach used in Yellowstone was designed to address these problems. By holding the wolves in acclimation pens for several weeks, The biologists hope to give the animals time to adjust to the sensory environment of the park, to become familiar with the smells and sounds of the landscape around them, and to form or strengthen the social bonds within pack groups that would be essential for successful cooperative hunting. Elk, bison, and other prey animals passed near the acclimation pens. The wolves could smell them, could hear them, could see them through the wire on clear days. The anticipatory behavior the biologist observed, the alertness, the focused attention, the visible excitation when prey animals were nearby, confirmed that the wolves were healthy and that their predatory instincts were fully intact. Prey can survive the immediate presence of a predator behind a fence, but the predator knows what it smells. And when the fence is removed, the knowledge is complete and immediate. The weeks in the acclimation pens were also weeks of intense public and media attention. Yellowstone National Park is one of the most visited places in the United States. Even in January and early February, when visitation is far below summer levels, the park receives hundreds of thousands of visitors, many of them deeply interested in wildlife. The news that wolves were in the park, even behind fences, was enough to draw journalists and photographers from across the country. The National Park Service managed this attention carefully. The locations of the acclimation pens were not publicly disclosed in detail. A buffer zone was maintained around each pen to prevent human activity from disturbing the wolves during their adjustment period. Officials gave regular press briefings about the progress of the reintroduction, but avoided providing information that could help opponents locate the pens. The legal challenges had not stopped when the trucks crossed the border. Federal courts were still receiving injunctions from opponents of the reintroduction seeking to halt the release. The legal uncertainty added tension to what was already an emotionally charged situation. For the biologists who had spent years working toward this moment, the possibility that a court order could stop the release even after the wolves were in their pens was a source of real anxiety. The courts ultimately declined to issue the requested injunctions. But the legal battles were a preview of what was coming. The wolves were in Yellowstone, but their future was not secure. It would not be secure for a very long time, and some would argue that it is not entirely secure even now. What secured it, at least for the critical early years, was biology. The wolves were extraordinarily good at being wolves. Within the acclimation pens, the pack social structures that had begun forming during the capture and transport phase continued to develop and strengthen. Pair bonds formed between animals that had been paired based on the biologist's assessment of compatible temperaments and genetic diversity. The pups from the previous summer, some of which had been captured along with their parents, learned from the adults the behavior patterns that would be essential for survival in their new home. When the gates finally opened and the wolves moved out into Yellowstone, they carried with them not just the biology of their species, but the social knowledge of their pack groups. They were not individuals released into a landscape. They were social units, already coherent and already functioning, moving as coordinated teams into a territory that was new to them, but that their senses and instincts were superbly adapted to read. The first hunts were watched by biologists from ridges above the valleys where the wolves were moving. The radio collar signals allowed the scientists to track the position of each animal. The topography of the Lamar Valley and a few other areas in the park provided sightlines that sometimes allowed direct observation with spotting scopes from distances that did not disturb the animals. What the biologists saw in those first hunts was not the invincible predator of popular imagination. It was something more interesting. A set of highly capable hunters working together with obvious experience and coordination, probing elk herds for weakness, testing individual animals, retreating when the elk stood their ground or the terrain favored the prey, pursuing when an individual showed signs of vulnerability. The first successful kill by a Yellowstone wolf in 70 years happened in early April 1995. The biologists who had been monitoring the radio signals that night tracked the pack to a location in the Lamar Valley and arrived at first light to find the carcass of an adult cow elk, partially consumed, surrounded by wolf tracks in the snow. They stood there for a long time in the cold April morning, looking at what they were seeing. The scientific data began immediately. GPS coordinates, photographs, assessment of the prey animal's age and condition, samples for disease screening, documentation of the cause of death, the characteristic puncture wounds at the throat that identify a wolf kill. But before the data collection, for a few moments, they just stood there. Something had happened that had not happened in this valley for 7 decades. A wolf had killed an elk in Yellowstone. The system had taken one step toward becoming, again, what it had always been meant to be. The spring and summer of 1995 brought more kills, more pups, more data, and more visibility for the project. The public's interest was intense and growing. Wolf watchers with spotting scopes began gathering along the road through the Lamar Valley in the early mornings, watching the open meadows where the packs moved. The Druid Peak Pack, which had established territory in the Lamar Valley and which would become the most closely observed wolf pack in history, was visible frequently enough to generate the kind of continuous public attention that turned individual wolves into celebrities with names and personalities recognizable to thousands of regular visitors. The famous wolves of Yellowstone became characters in a story that millions of people were following with intense engagement. Wolf 21, the dominant male of the Druid Peak Pack, became something like a legend, a massive, unusually pale gray wolf of extraordinary physical power, who was never observed killing a defeated rival, an act of restraint so unusual in wolf behavior that it drew comment from biologists who had spent decades studying the species. Wolf 42, a female who fought her way from a subordinate position to become the alpha of the pack, demonstrated a social cunning and strategic intelligence that the biologists who watched her found remarkable. These were not just animals, they were individuals with distinct personalities and life histories, existing in relationships of remarkable complexity with each other and with the landscape around them. The biologists who spent years watching them speak about them now with a combination of scientific precision and something that sounds very much like affection, the kind of affection that comes from long, close observation of living beings whose inner lives are genuinely compelling. And the wolves, in their entirely unsentimental way, were getting on with the work of transforming the ecosystem around them. By the end of 1995, 3 packs were established in the park. By 1996, a second cohort of wolves had been brought from Canada to supplement the initial release and increase genetic diversity. By 1997, wolf pups born in Yellowstone were themselves reaching reproductive age, and the population was beginning to grow on its own momentum without further augmentation from Canada. The recovery was happening faster than most of the biologists had dared to predict. The park's elk population, which had been high and was now under pressure from both wolf predation and behavioral displacement, began to show the first signs of stabilization. The data was preliminary, noisy with year-to-year variation, difficult to interpret with confidence, but the direction was consistent. Something was changing in the data, in the landscape, in the animals. Something that had been absent and broken for 70 years was beginning slowly and imperfectly and with enormous complexity to reassemble itself. Not because anyone had planned for all of it, not because the science had perfectly predicted it, but because the wolves were there, and they were doing what wolves do. And what wolves do, it turns out, is hold an entire world together. There is a question that haunts the story of the wolves of Yellowstone, and it is the question that any honest examination of this story must eventually confront. If we know what happens when we remove large predators from ecosystems, if the science is clear, if the evidence from Yellowstone and from dozens of other systems around the world points in the same direction, why are we still removing them? The world is in the midst of a wildlife crisis of staggering proportions. Large predator populations are declining on every continent. Lions have lost more than 90% of their historical range in Africa. Tigers occupy less than 7% of the area they inhabited at the beginning of the 20th century. Jaguars have been eliminated from more than half their former range in the Americas. Wolves are absent from vast areas of Europe and Asia where they were historically present. This is not ancient history. Most of this has happened within living memory. The world in which your grandparents were born had far more wild predators than the world you were born into, and the world your children will inhabit may have far fewer still, unless something changes. The reasons for this ongoing decline are the same reasons wolves were eliminated from Yellowstone in the first place, just operating at a larger scale and with greater urgency. Growing human populations need more land for agriculture. More land for agriculture means less wildland. Less wildland means less habitat for large predators that require vast territories. And where large predators survive close to human settlements and livestock operations, conflict follows. And conflict usually ends the same way it ended in the American West in the early 20th century. The lessons of Yellowstone do not make this easier to solve. Knowing that wolves are ecologically valuable does not create more land or eliminate the legitimate economic concerns of people who lose livestock. Knowing that lions maintain the health of African savanna ecosystems does not compensate a Maasai herder for a cow killed in the night. But the lessons of Yellowstone do change the terms of the conversation. They change what we know we are losing when we lose a large predator, and they suggest some possibilities that would not be visible without that knowledge. One of the most important of these possibilities is rewilding. Rewilding is the deliberate restoration of large animals, including large predators, to landscapes from which they have been removed. It is a conservation strategy that takes seriously what Yellowstone demonstrated, that ecosystems are not simply the sum of their species, but are dynamic systems whose functioning depends on the interactions between those species, and that restoring missing components can have cascading positive effects on the whole. Rewilding projects are now underway across Europe, North America, Africa, and parts of Asia. In Europe, where wolves had been eliminated from most of the continent, natural recolonization from remnant populations in Italy and Poland has been assisted in some countries by deliberate reintroduction efforts. Wolves have returned to Germany, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and many other countries where they have been absent for over a century. The responses have been similar to those in Yellowstone. Intense conflict with livestock operations, significant controversy in rural communities, and documented positive ecological effects in areas where wolf populations have established themselves. In Britain, where wolves have been absent for perhaps 5 centuries, a serious scientific and policy debate about potential wolf reintroduction to the Scottish Highlands is ongoing. proponents point to the degraded state of the Scottish uplands, stripped of trees by centuries of overgrazing by deer populations with no natural predators, and argue that wolves could trigger the kind of ecological recovery that Yellowstone has demonstrated. Opponents point to the density of sheep farming in the highlands and argue that the economic and social costs would be prohibitive. The same debate, in different forms with different local specifics, is happening in countries around the world. And at the center of every such debate is the same fundamental question that the story of Yellowstone forces us to ask. What do we want the natural world to look like? What are we willing to accept and sacrifice and change to have a world that includes wild predators in functional wild ecosystems? These are not questions with easy answers. They are not even questions with universally correct answers, because they depend, in part, on values, on how people weigh the needs of human communities against the needs of wild animals and wild ecosystems, and reasonable people can and do weigh those things differently. But they are questions that must be asked with full knowledge of what is at stake, and what is at stake is not simply the survival of a particular charismatic predator. It is the health and functioning of the living systems that regulate the climate, purify the water, maintain the soil, and make the planet habitable for the 8 billion human beings who currently live on it. We do not often think about this. We do not often draw the connection between the health of wild ecosystems and the conditions of human life, because the connection runs through long chains of indirect effects that are invisible in everyday experience. But the connection is real. It is documented. It is quantifiable. The wolves of Yellowstone changed rivers. Changed rivers create more stable water supplies for the communities downstream. More stable water supplies support agriculture, reduce flood damage, maintain the quality of drinking water. These are not abstract ecological values. They are material human interests. Healthy predator-prey ecosystems maintain diverse and resilient wildlife communities. Diverse and resilient wildlife communities are less susceptible to disease outbreaks, including diseases that can jump to domestic animals and to humans. This is not a theoretical concern. Chronic wasting disease, a devastating prion disease affecting deer and elk in North America, appears to spread more slowly in populations that are subject to predation because predators preferentially remove the sick and weakened animals that are most infectious. The wolves in Yellowstone have been shown in some studies to reduce the rate of chronic wasting disease transmission in local elk populations. If that effect is real and substantial at scale, the value of wolf predation to deer and elk hunting as an economic and cultural activity in the long run may be positive rather than negative. Counterintuitive as that seems to the hunters who have traditionally opposed wolf reintroduction on the grounds that wolves compete with them for game. Nature does not sort neatly into categories of beneficial and harmful, friend and enemy, valuable and worthless. It is a system of relationships, each one shaping and shaped by dozens of others, operating over time scales that dwarf human memory and across spatial scales that exceed human vision. The wolves teach us this, not as an abstract lesson, but as a lived and documented reality. In the Lamar Valley of Yellowstone, in the hour before dawn on a cold November morning, the fog lies low in the valley and the willows along the river are tall enough to disappear into it. The river moves quietly between banks that are more stable than they were 20 years ago. Somewhere in the willows, a beaver moves in the dark, carrying a branch to its winter cache beneath the ice. Above the valley, a great gray owl hunts the meadow edges, on silent wings. In a bend of the river where the current has deposited a gravel bar, a cutthroat trout holds in the current, waiting for whatever the morning will bring. And somewhere in the timber above the valley floor, in the darkness under the lodgepole pines, a wolf raises its head. It has been traveling since before midnight. Its collar, the 10th or 12th generation of such collars to be worn by Yellowstone wolves since 1995, pulses a signal into the darkness. The signal travels to a satellite and then to a receiver in a field station 50 kilometers away, where it is logged automatically into a database that now contains millions of location points, representing nearly 3 decades of continuous observation of one of the most studied predator populations on the planet. The wolf stretches. It looks out over the dark valley. It smells the cold air that carries the scent of elk several hundred meters below, bedded in a meadow near the river. It does not decide anything. It does not plan. It responds to the information in its body and its senses, the hunger, the smell, the memory of the terrain it has traveled, the awareness of the other pack members scattered behind it in the trees. And then it begins to move downslope toward the valley. What happens next, whether the hunt succeeds, whether the elk escapes, whether another pack intervenes and drives this wolf away from its quarry, whether the morning ends in death or in survival, is in one sense just another event in the continuous stream of events that constitutes life in a wild ecosystem. But in another sense, it is everything. It is the whole story, happening again as it has been happening every day and every night for nearly 30 years, since the day a female wolf stepped through an open gate into the snow of Yellowstone and changed the world she entered. The wolves are architects, not because they design anything, not because they intend anything beyond the immediate imperative of survival, but because the consequences of their survival cascade through the system around them in ways that build and shape and sustain the living structure of an entire landscape. Every kill is a design decision that neither wolf nor elk makes consciously, but that the ecosystem records and responds to. Every pack territory is a zone of influence that ripples outward from the killing ground through the riparian zone, into the river, down the food chain, up into the canopy, and out across the watershed. The wolves do not know this. They cannot know it, but we can. And knowing it, we carry a weight that no previous generation of human beings has carried in quite the same way. We know what we lose when we lose a predator. We know the hidden price of a landscape from which the hunters have been removed. We know that what looks like a park without wolves is not a park at all, but a system bleeding out slowly through a wound we made ourselves. We also know because Yellowstone has shown us that it is possible to heal, not perfectly, not quickly, not without conflict and cost and kind of complicated negotiation between human interests and ecological reality that does not lend itself to simple stories. But the willows are growing in Yellowstone. The rivers are narrower and deeper and cooler than they were in 1995. The beavers are building. The trout are in the cold pools behind the dams. The eagles are overhead, and somewhere in the timber, a wolf moves through the dark. That is the story, all of it. Not the simple version where the wolves came back and the ecosystem was saved. The real version, where a handful of animals carrying radio collars and the weight of 70 years of absence came back to a landscape that had been slowly failing without them and began, in ways that were sometimes subtle and sometimes dramatic and always interconnected, to change it. They changed the elk. The elk changed the plants. The plants changed the rivers. The rivers changed the fish. The fish changed the birds. The birds changed the land. The land changed the water. The water changed the next generation of every living thing that depended on it. And in the spaces between these changes, in the cold water and the tall willows and the beaver ponds full of dragonflies and the gravel bars where trout hold in the current, something called a functional ecosystem is reassembling itself, piece by piece, relationship by relationship, year by patient year. It is one of the most important things that has happened in conservation in the last century. It is also, if we are paying attention, one of the most important things that could happen anywhere on Earth. The wolves are architects of the wild. They do not know it, but the wild knows. Every river that runs cleaner and cooler and straighter and more alive than it did before knows it. Every stand of willows tall enough to cast a shadow on the water knows it. Every beaver, every trout, every eagle, every elk knows it in the language of behavior and physiology and survival that is older than language itself. And now you know it too. What you do with that knowledge is up to you.